2.
Hi, everyone. It's another day of Get Paid, and Kimberly and I are here, and we are excited to have a guest today. Our guest is Sheena Foley. Sheena is somebody who has a long background in human resources. She was head of HR for a Fortune 500 company, and in the last 4 years or so has gone out on her own and is doing consulting, working with CEOs, doing some coaching on all kinds of topics. And so we are excited to have her here today. And I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly to take it away, because we had some conversation last week about the idea of blind interviewing. And we got some good feedback, and that's what we're going to continue the conversation about today, recruiting and other kinds of subjects related.
Okay, so hey everybody, it's good to be here, and it's really good to be here with Sheena. Sheena and I have known each other for some time, and so, I get really great constructive feedback from Sheena on a regular basis, and when we have conversations, I love our conversations because they're always very honest, and we can talk about any subject, and we can be provocative, and really come at it so that at the end of the conversation, we both land someplace differently. Mm-hmm. So last week, Deb and I brought up blind interviewing, right? How do we get on the other side of this problem that we continue to have, where once you get past the individual contributor, leadership teams still are not diverse, boards still are not diverse. How do we get there? So we said, well, maybe, we could do like The Voice. We could just, wipe everything away, and all you talk about is what your skills are. And so we thought we came up with a pretty damn good idea. And then Sheena heard us and sent me a message, and she said, hold on. Well, let's talk about that. And so as we talked about it, I said, wait, this is too good for you and I just to keep it to ourselves. There's some incredible nuggets that people would learn from, and it could be a stepping off place for people to really start at least thinking differently or doing something differently. So Sheena, why don't you share your perspective of like what you told me when you said, okay, pump the brakes, chick. Let's just look at
I didn't say pump the brake, chick, but okay, let's be clear. You definitely didn't ask me for feedback, and I definitely put it out there, whether you wanted it or not. So I appreciate you having me on your show, and Deborah, nice to meet you and be here with you guys. So what would you like me to tell you my thoughts on the masked interviewing?
Absolutely. Please. Because we have a lot of people who thought, brilliant. And so I want you to explain it, because the way we talked about it, it was helpful because it gave us another perspective.
Yeah, and it's my point of view. So, start there, which is only one point of view, and it doesn't encompass, massive amounts of data. But it was wonderful to watch, and I've watched most of the shows, but that one caught my eye. One, because you both got so excited about the idea, and I was like, hang on a second, wait, we got to talk about this. Because the idea, which is very, very trend right now, so it was right up there on, you guys are right with the times. The idea made me really stop as I was listening to the two talk about it, and I thought, why are we having to go all the way to hiding people? At least that was like my interpretation of what I heard.
Right.
For the right person to get the job. And so I love it because it was provocative, and I do my best thinking when someone does something like that, bring up a provocative thought. And like, that's about as extreme as we could get. Next thing, I was worried you were going to get to is people could wear literally masks and costumes, and maybe we'll go that route.
Oh, but that's the masked dancer.
Yeah. There you go. But it was a really good provocative thought, which I think is the catalyst for most change.
Yes.
And it really, again, as we've talked about, it brought me back to a place that said, why are we having to hide? Why are we going to that extreme? Mm-hmm. And it was disheartening in some ways, because I thought it's not a bad idea, but why is it not a bad idea? Because you're trying to take all the prejudice out of the interview process in hopes to diversify teams more, in hopes to make sure more people have an opportunity for the role. And it made me think of, let's go back to the root cause.
Yeah.
And I don't want to abuse that statement, that idea of root cause, but it's like, why do we have to hide them? And I think, as we were talking earlier, with Deborah, you know, the judgment on candidates starts, for me, and having read so many resumes, it starts with that first piece of paper. So before you even get an interview, let alone if you're behind a wall, you're already being judged, which is why people panic so much about what their resume looks like, which is about as fun to do as your taxes every year.
Yeah.
And so there's that element that has to be dealt with, right? Resumes have got to change because we don't really get a lot out of them, and we judge too much out of them, right?
We don't read them enough. We don't really.
Well, and it's a piece of paper, but the value, the weight of that piece of paper so much. I mean, you know, to your point, Sheena, you judge from that piece of paper. So let's say your parents were hippies and they wanted to name you, you know, Bamboozle Jones.
Apple.
You're going to look at that and it's going to be like, I'm not looking at this resume. Or when I was, you know, in school and they said, well, you definitely have to take off these organizations that say that you're Black because your name, Kimberly Minor, I mean, that's kind of like being a masked interview, right? Because all you know is I'm Kimberly Lee and I grew up in the suburb of Philadelphia because that's my address. And I went to these schools and here's my experience. So that's kind of a mask until they see you. And, you know, that's a whole nother show of the experiences that I've had that when Kimberly shows up and they're like, oh, Kimberly Minor, or I mean, Kimberly Lee, whatever. They would look all around me and I'd be the only person sitting there like,
well, and so that goes back to the idea. You are already blind to the candidate, right? By virtue of the resume is where you might, and now my opinion would be it's even worse now because all these companies have set up these algorithms or whatever you want to use technical term for it, where if you don't have certain words on your resume, it doesn't even cut through.
Right.
So you no longer have half a dozen recruiters actually looking at resumes trying to be objective. They at least try to be objective, I think, largely when they go through resumes. Although, again, they can't tell much because to your point, Kimberly, your story was very different than what was on paper. They made a ton of assumptions. Same with mine, as I've said, you know, they would be looking for my pedigree, which wouldn't hit their standard. And I would go to the side unless you knew someone. So we have always known the power for getting in has always been through who you know.
Right.
And because the interview is not a big part of it because the judgment's been made before you sit down. I've already decided what you look like. I've probably already decided what you sound like. And I probably already decided whether you have the skill set or not. So my listening skills are already pretty low.
Yeah.
That's before I've met you. Right. And now if you put me in an interview where I can't see the person, I think the hiring managers will just go a little crazy because they'll spend more time in judgment, which I was alluding to earlier, which is I'll spend more time trying to listen to see what accent you're from. Then I might likely go down silly rabbit holes like, is that a Boston accent I hear? Are you from Boston? Like, how are you from Boston, but you went to this school? Like, what happened that
Who
I
are you?
know about, right?
Right.
So the more I can't see you, it just comes out of curiosity. And like we said, some of the natural traits we have, which I want to judge you. That's what I'm doing in the interview process. I want to assess, but most of the time I want to judge you. So that's why I had the reaction I had. Again, I love that it came up because it was like, okay, well, why is Deborah suggesting this? Why did it even come up?
Mm-hmm.
You know, go ahead, Deborah.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to say, I think for me that the idea came to me because of something I was listening to, but I think the real thought process in my head is how do you get the interviewer to go after the things that are important to determine whether the person can do the job or not without being distracted by the biases, unconscious or otherwise, that are there in those interview processes. And that's where my head was going. And I think, you know, after having myself so many years within HR and companies and then being an executive recruiter, you know, you see what kind of interview processes they put people through, and they're so surface. To your point, like there's so much about trying to figure out where the person came and do we know somebody similar, and they're less about can you do this job and does what you bring to the table going to be additive to what we need in this company. And that's where it kind of falls apart, to your point. But it was just more a spark of, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could get rid of that?
Yeah, and then that's why I thought it was a really good thing, and it made me take a lot of notes, and it made me think a lot. It was, as we spoke earlier, it was like, well, maybe you need to start at a place that most people have never ever taken a class on how to interview, right?
Right.
And as we spoke, the only change, and this definitely glossed over and generalized, but the biggest change in recruiting over the last 40 years has been go from closed-ended questions to open-ended questions to maybe, if you're really good, behavioral-based questions. Which just trip people up, right? Largely, they trip people up, and they're interesting because they're supposed to make people talk a little bit more, and you're supposed to get to know them a little bit more by hearing about their experience. But in fact, what I've seen is most people get so tripped up on trying to find that right experience that's now going to answer the question. It still has nothing to do with whether you can do the job or not.
Right.
My favorite one, which does tell you a lot about the person, but as I've used before, my favorite one being like, so tell me a time when you failed, and what did that feel like? It's like, okay, so the question's interesting.
It is.
What are you trying to get to? So if you're trying to get to whether the person can lead and hold themselves accountable, then let's talk about that. But these tricky behavioral questions, I think, have gotten in the way. So again, the idea that we're asking managers who we have not changed how they recruit since they were probably in their first managerial job.
Yeah.
We've taught them all these horrific rules. I think, Kimberly, you brought up an example to me at one point in time that the interviewer said no to someone because the person kept saying "I."
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Like one of the best examples, because we're taught in some recruiting lab, class that we have to take, who's been taught, by the way, by probably some really good-hearted HR person who has never had to hire a person for their team before.
Right.
Let alone for your team. And so those are the only questions I know. And I was taught that rule that if somebody says, I know that they're probably selfish, they're probably not a team player. Well, no, they probably just, they just want to talk about what they've done since it's their interviews. So I is going to likely come up.
Exactly. And on top of that, it was a woman of color who was saying I, because she was leading a team and she was explaining what her contribution was to leading that team. And so it made perfect sense to me. And I don't know that it was because I was a woman of color and knew that, okay, in order to get any job at this level, you have to come in having done it already and built it a goal and done it over and over again to even get considered. So I'm sure that she felt that pressure as well. And then to be turned down because, don't know if she can be a team player. She said I. But there weren't 8 people in the room. You were interviewing her. Yeah. And I often wonder, because I don't have another reference. I haven't, but when I talk to other friends and colleagues who aren't women of color or men of color, I've asked them, because when it happened, it just kind of shook me a little bit. And I asked the question, I'm like, do you say I or do you say we? They're like, well, I'm one person, so I say I. Oh, just checking.
But it's one of those rules, right? It's right. And so it wasn't surprising to me that the person said that, because it's a rule that whether it's HR or whatever class you're taking has made up. And Deb, this is more your field than mine. There's probably 24 of those types of rules that as soon as it clicks, as soon as someone does one of those things, the interview shuts down. Mm-hmm. So I think I go back to why I brought that up is I think that, the idea of hiding the candidates, very provocative. The idea of retraining people how to recruit and listen, more interesting, maybe, right? Because if I take that same person and, again, are the hiring managers, do they really know they're accountable for that hire? I'm not a big believer in that it should go on performance reviews or in their paychecks, but did anybody ever spend time with that leader, that individual, to talk about, here are different ways? Have they ever seen a good interview? My guess is that individual had never seen a good interview.
Right.
Right. And only had 30 minutes. And so the easier thing was to say, HR brought me the wrong person. She said I too many times. I don't have any more time. Bring me someone that's easier that I don't have to have that conflict with. So there's so much wasted time in the recruiting process because we're not spending time on the root cause, like teaching people how to do proper interviews. You know, anytime I'm told that there's a rule, I tend to like to break it because it usually tells me something is wrong.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, if we just took the time with all the recruiting rules and sat down, we could defy every one of them and we could come up with a reason why that recruiting rule is wrong.
Yeah.
Right. And why that probably defers you. But then you got to get into conversations with hiring managers. Like, do you care who you hire? Do you care about diversifying your team? And if you do, what does that mean to you? And then what questions are you going to ask?
Right. And why do you want to diversify?
Like, I would rather see someone interview off one question versus I asked 25 questions. They didn't have what I needed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could ask 100 questions and never know what you needed, but I could have one conversation with you.
That's right.
And build a lifetime career for you if I really had a good conversation with you.
And that is such an important, I'm sorry, but that is such an important point. It's such an important point because when I interview people, that's what I do. I have conversations because people can tell you so much more if they feel comfortable and they're having a conversation with you, as opposed to you just asking questions that everyone else is going to ask. And I, you know, I'm proud to say that most of the people that I've hired, they stick.
Yeah.
Right. So there's definitely
or they know pretty clearly when it doesn't work out why. Right? Why? It's other things, and you'll hear when we get to the end of this, like, why do people have their interviews in their office? It's a power play, right? You've heard the rule.
That's right.
Sit across from the person, hold the chair of power, right? And then if you're a little bit sweeter, nicer, you know, sort of thing, you've been told don't sit across the desk because that shows power, right? Sit beside them, sit in front of each other. Well, that's just uncomfortable. I don't know you.
I'm sitting next to you. What?
But it's a rule, so I guess I have to try it, right? It's like, I don't want to sit right beside you. I am interviewing you, you know, sort of thing. But why don't I walk down the hall if it's a merchant I'm hiring? And why don't I go sit in a room filled with product and let you talk to me about product? If I'm hiring somebody for HR, why don't I meet you in the retail space areas? Why don't I meet you at a store? So you can tell me what you see, what you hear, what you're thinking. If you're going to be in the technical division, let's go and let's look at some of these sites and let's have you tell me what you think and what you would do differently. So there's so many ways if someone really wants to diversify their team and find the right talent, because I don't think it's about just like the diversity piece is a big piece of it, but the interview process itself is so broken and archaic that to then add on that it would be powerful to diversify your teams and make yourself stronger that way through thought and partnership, that it makes it even more complicated.
That's right.
Yeah. So I see a lot of people freezing up with the recruiting process instead of doing what I think, which is just exploding the whole
And I think some of the better processes that I've seen, because I think you're right. I mean, people like us, you know, who have been interviewing people for many, many years and understand the power of the conversation and understand the power of the unspoken, not only the spoken, and kind of feeling people out. But if you don't have that experience, some of the better companies I've seen, they at least do preparation in advance of the interview, and they make sure that people know, these are the types of questions and things you should be asking about in the interview because these are important to your relationship with this person potentially. And this is what you should be asking because and maybe not completely prescriptive, but enough information for that recruiter or whoever, or that person recruiting to have some sense of where this conversation is supposed to go and what am I supposed to get out of it, so that not everybody is just sitting down with the person and saying, take me through your background, because then you end up with 6 people who've heard the same thing and are judging best on, you know, who the heck knows what.
Well, and then by the 4th interview, the candidate comes across very poorly, right? Because they've had to answer the same question every time. So I agree with you. When we were at our best, we would at least say, listen, the person's going to have 6 interviews today, God forbid, but here's where I want you to focus on for each of you. And don't get me wrong, I think there's some immensely talented recruiters and immensely talented hiring managers out there. I just don't think it's the norm.
Right.
And I think when it comes to D&I, and Kimberly has heard me say this ad nauseum, there are 2 ends of the spectrum. I think that if you don't hit and you don't hit aggressively everything else you do in the middle, which is where a lot of people are spending their time, it just won't work. It won't stick. And if you look at your company's history, it's the same path you've taken. It just sounds a little different, looks a little different, but it's probably exactly the same because you haven't hit the two ends. You have got to really change up the recruiting things, and you've got to change up the leadership. And I can talk about that another time.
That's a whole nother series. I think the whole idea of creating leaders who are performers and operators as opposed to leaders, right? There's a whole nother
conversation there. But and I sent you the article about, was it in the financial world, both in North America and the UK, when they've lost all minorities basically in the highest level position.
Oh, yeah.
Where they had made a huge commitment to shifting that, and both from a gender, race, and so on. And they're right back. They're pretty much right back at zero. And it's like, so what does that tell you about what?
It didn't work.
And what
was the commitment?
Because subliminally or unintentionally, if you look up and you're part of the management team and your value says that that diversity makes us stronger, and you even understand the business case, but if you look up at the executive group and you don't see that, then why bother? Like, why am I got to go the extra mile? They didn't go the extra mile, so I will go the extra mile, but I won't worry about it if I don't diversify my team, because guess what? My boss's team's not diversified.
Right.
He or she doesn't really believe that. So it's like, whatever mom or dad says, right? If your mom, I can't think of a really great example or analogy for it right now, but if the lead person for the company is not taking action with what they control, then everybody else knows there is likely be no punishment or no repercussion for following the same way.
Oh, yeah.
So we see that in all aspects of our lives, I think, this year.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. So, okay. So I guess, as I'm thinking about what we just talked about, I think of more things that I want to talk about, but I know that this is, 20-minute show. Right. So here's where we are. How about, Sheena, because usually it's Deb and I, how about you just take us home? What is your bottom line?
I wish I had one.
Well, you can give us.
It's so easy, Deb. My bottom line on this is please don't do mass interviewing. But if you're going to do it, I want to be there for the first one so I can see where I'm wrong, because it's very, very possible I'm wrong. But on the recruiting side of it, to me, the bottom line is, and I wish I had a great example, and I'm still looking for that great, I'm sure it exists out there, but we've got to push harder to change the norm. Mm-hmm. We've got to start at a place that says everything we've been doing, as hard as it might be for some to hear, everything we've done is wrong. And it doesn't fit into the world you're trying to create. And that means structurally, how the recruiting teams are set up. It means the technology they're using. It means who's in those roles. It means everything from what experience and degrees are they coming in with. Where are you finding your recruiters from? And all those rules, you have to take every one of those rules, and we just have to unleash them and say that's not a rule anymore. Right. People have to come from these universities, or people have to, come from these states. The recruiters are highly bound by metrics and rules that the organization gives them. I think we just have to really push to try everything differently when it comes to recruiting. But that means sitting down and really saying, so I won't use the technology's name, but, we're using one technology largely for recruiting. That's insane to me. Right. It's interesting. It's a great play on the technology standpoint, but it hasn't got, if you look within your organization, my guess is it hasn't gotten you any further down this path of making your team stronger through the idea of diversifying your team. Yeah. So that would my bottom line would be change, like do it differently, but drastically.
Yeah.
If you have 12 recruiters on your team, go down to 2, but make those 2 give them this, give them budgets, give them titles, give them access to things. So I just think it has to be really severely broken. Mm-hmm. and broken up and changed to try something different. I sent a video to you I think last week, of a government who knew well enough that their recruiters, as great as their recruiting team was, didn't have the network to diversify the government in leadership type roles.
Right.
And they've been trying for 4 or 5 years now. They just don't have the network, right? And so the conversations weren't sincere necessarily. I don't have all the ins and outs of it. But they went out and hired a firm who does have the network.
Right.
So they had to find that money somewhere. You know, something got changed inside for them to find that money. But boy, I mean, that's not a hard putt.
No.
You know, to go find someone who's got that. I have a really good network, but I don't know if I have that network. And that company they hired, by the way, doing all the advertising for them. And I can get into that another time. But that to me was like, oh, that's different. I haven't heard of another government doing that.
Right.
Going out of their own way and saying we'll use external sources for this, and somebody who's already got it. So anyways, my bottom line is change, and change hard, like really work hard to do things differently and get other people involved in the dialogue.
Well, thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay. So we're not going to be here next week.
Nope. We're taking a hiatus.
Yeah. 1 week, and then we'll be back. We're going to continue this conversation when we come back. And we hope everyone just has a fabulous week. You learned something today. I always learn something when I talk to Sheena. And so hopefully this is helpful. If you're in your organization and you know there needs to be change, you need to think, not just iterate, but disrupt.
Yes. Thank you so much. It was really great to have you here today.
Oh, it was great. Thanks for having me, guys.
All right. You
Bye.
guys take care. See ya.
All right. Take care.